Hi everyone, this week we are looking at chapter 8 on cognition. We're building on what we have learned about with learning and memory, kind of putting them together to talk about a little bit more active processes of thinking and thought. So we'll talk about the building blocks of thought, how we use that for problem solving, a little bit about intelligence and different mental abilities, how the environment and heredity and all of those things play a role, and then extremes of intelligence, including creativity. So when we talk about cognition, we can define that as the processes whereby we acquire and use knowledge. So we had to learn information through some process of conditioning or exposure, repetition, and then we hold on to that memory, or hold on to that information we have learned through memory, which is our ability to retain and store information. Now we're going to acquire and use the knowledge that we have learned. And in order to do that, we often talk about the building blocks of thought, that we have these three elements combining together to help us with acquiring information and then using and representing that information in some way. And those are language, images, and concepts. And language, right, we all have a flexible system of communication that we use, sounds, rules, gestures, or symbols. This can be spoken, it can be written. It's some way that we communicate meaning to other people, or can gain meaning from things that we use through language. And we go through quite a process of learning language, which I went into a little bit in the textbook if you wanted to read more about that. But we acquire language, and then it allows us to have kind of a universal or shared way of communicating and understanding the world around us. Images are some kind of mental representation of a sensory experience. We use them to think about things, right? Like if you were to picture a thunderstorm, right? If you were to close your eyes and picture a thunderstorm, you might picture the lightning and the clouds and the rain, right? To kind of get like an image in your head of what that would look like, right? Images can go a long way in kind of representing a sensory experience or something in our life. And then we might use language to describe it to somebody else. And concepts are mental categories for classifying objects, people, experiences. So we could say we have a concept of animals or books or plants, or whatever category we want to try and put things into to classify. And so we use these different building blocks of thought to formulate ideas, to solve problems, to understand the world around us and interact with it in kind of very dynamic ways. We get all this information and we hold on to it, but then we have to use it in some way. And we use that through the process of cognition. So we use them to formulate thoughts, but more than that, we also use these things to help us understand the world, to solve problems, and to make decisions. So one of the things that we often talk about quite a bit when it comes to cognition is problem solving. How do we use these building blocks of thought, our thoughts about the world around us, to solve different problems? And this could be something really small, like what do I wear today? What do I eat for breakfast? Or it could be something much larger of like, what do I want to major in? What am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do about X, right? You're trying to solve some problems. And this is a very dynamic, involved process. Or when you're trying to problem solve, you go through multiple stages of trying to interpret the problem, right? Identifying, defining, and interpreting the problem in front of you. And then you often implement strategies hoping that you can solve the problem. And we'll talk about some strategies in a moment that you might use. And then we're going to evaluate, right? Are our strategies working, or do we need to go back and try different strategies? Have I not defined the problem correctly? Right? And so it's kind of this ongoing like cyclical pattern of defining and interpreting the problem, implementing strategies to try and solve it, evaluating whether or not they worked, and then maybe kind of going back to the drawing board depending on your progress and evaluation. When we're trying to use some of those different problem solving strategies, we can clump those into three main groups. When we're trying to solve a problem, we might have a moment of insight, we might use algorithms, or we might use heuristics. And all of them are great in their own way and for their own specific situations. Insight is like when the light bulb goes off over your head. It's a sudden and novel realization to a solution for a problem. right? So maybe you are trying to figure something out and it's just like, boom, you get it out of nowhere, right? Insight can feel really good, right? When that light bulb goes off, but it's definitely not something that is guaranteed. It happens sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. So we often use more like intentional strategies like algorithms and heuristics. Algorithms are wonderful if you are working on something that it's appropriate for. So algorithms are often used for solving like mathematical equations. They're very commonly used to, like, if you're solving for X or finding the slope, you follow the rhythm or the algorithm of the format or the rule that you have. It's a step-by-step method, and it's going to guarantee a correct solution if you use it properly for the proper use as well. Much more common than algorithms, which only tend to apply to specific situations, we often use what are called heuristics, general rules of thumb that help us to simplify and solve problems. They don't guarantee correct solutions, but they often get us a little bit closer. And so we use heuristics all the time. And there are tons of them, but here are three very commonly used ones: hill climbing, sub goals, and working backward. And again, there are an absolute ton of these, but hill climbing is when you take one step closer, right, to the final goal, like systematically making like one little step of progress at a time, trying to get to the top of the mountain. For example, when you're taking a multiple choice exam, let's say you read the question and you know right off the bat, okay, I know it's not D, so I'm going to cross out D. You're one step closer. Now you know that it's either A, B, or C. And you go, I'm pretty sure it's not B. So you cross off B. And you've gotten yourself closer to the end result by eliminating two of them. So one little step at a time to get you to the final goal. Sub goals is another very common one. I imagine a lot of you use this just like I do. I had to write a master's thesis as part of my master's program. And when they told us you're going to write a 130-page paper, that was incredibly overwhelming. And so I broke it up into smaller, more manageable sub goals in order to get me closer. Like, I'm going to write a 10-page intro and a 10-page methods and a 10-page this. 10 pages felt way more doable than 130. Oftentimes we break things up into smaller, more manageable goals so that it doesn't feel so intimidating and makes it easier for us to reach that final outcome. We also might work backward, right? Maybe you start at the end result and you systematically work backward from there. Like, you have $100 to buy new clothes. And so rather than adding up from 0, you subtract back from 100, right? Kind of starting with the end goal and working backward to the desired conditions. So we use these heuristics all the time, like little common step-by-step methods to help us get closer to solving a problem. Now, we can run into some obstacles, right? Just because we use heuristics doesn't mean they're guaranteed to work. We can run into things like mental set and functional fixedness when we're solving problems. Mental set is a tendency to perceive and approach problems in a certain way. Every single one of us has kind of like a default way of approaching different problems, right? We tend to view them in a certain way and approach them in a certain way, and it can be a little bit hard to think outside of what we're used to or comfortable with. Functional fixedness is a tendency to perceive only a limited number of uses for an object, which can make it hard to problem solve as well. Maybe you are so set on something being a certain way that you can't think about it differently in order to help you move past it. And some solutions for both of these obstacles, one of them is brainstorming. Think about any time you had to write an essay in an English class, they would typically have you brainstorm. Let's come up with every possible idea that we can. And then only once we've collected everything can we start like narrowing it down, trying to open it up and come up with as many possible solutions and as many ideas, and then we can evaluate them and see where we can go from there. Now, I have to tell you, and I added this in here because I absolutely love escape rooms. Anytime I think about problem solving, I think about escape rooms, right? And I have done, to this date, I have done 82 escape rooms. I absolutely love this. I think there's so much fun to do because they include an incredible amount of psychological stuff in them, right? When you get into an escape room, you need to engage in active problem solving. And you have to overcome some of those obstacles that we just talked about, like functional fixedness and mental set. Sometimes this is why it's so nice to have multiple people in a room. Oftentimes I do escape rooms with just my wife. My wife and I will go do escape rooms, and we have a very complementary skill set. There are certain types of puzzles that when I see them, I'm like, oh, forget it. Like, that's all you. And there are certain puzzles when she sees them, she has the same, like, oh, that's no, that's not my strength. Right. And every now and then we'll go into a room where the puzzles are neither of our strengths and we struggle because neither of us can move past our mental sets and functional fixedness. So in order to beat an escape room, right, you have to use a lot of this problem solving. Oftentimes they will make you use objects in unconventional ways in order to solve a problem. Or maybe you have to view something in a different way. You have to put pieces together, but you're applying all of this stuff from this cognition unit. Some tips I put together, right? Looking at the broader picture, not overthinking things, pass the baton. This is a tough one. We have a little like hardcore group of people. There's 4 of us, and we go do escape rooms together. And sometimes if you can't figure it out, having somebody else look at it, having multiple brains approaching things in different ways can be really, really helpful. Thinking of alternate uses for objects, having fun with it. These can be so much fun. If you've never tried an escape room, when it's safe, I definitely recommend it. My absolute favorite one is Lab Rat with Hatch Escapes. And then 60 Out has a bunch of ones that I love, Hide and Seek and Amityville, Houdini. Oh, there's so many, 82 of them. I could talk about this forever. But they're a very great way to solve problems in a fun context, to push yourself, and they can definitely make you aware of things like functional fixedness and mental set, for sure. A few other things before we wrap up this chapter. Intelligence. Intelligence is a big topic within the unit of cognition. Lots of different theories of intelligence. This has been a very popularly studied topic. We can define it in a very general way as a term referring to the ability involved in learning and adaptive behavior, a mental quality consisting of the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations. When you think about what it means to be intelligent, good place to mess that up, right? As you're talking about intelligence. I spelt this wrong once on the chalkboard or on the whiteboard, and that's a bad one to mess up. But when you're thinking about what it means to be intelligent, you might have different qualities that come to mind. Some people think of like a general intelligence, somebody who kind of just has a good global awareness of the world around them, and they're able to adapt and use that information well. You might think about specific types of multiple intelligence. There are a lot of people who have proposed that each one of us have different skilled areas of intelligence, and that maybe we are better with our like body kinesthetic intelligence versus musical intelligence or artistic, or we're better with numbers or reading languages. Lots of different theories about multiple intelligences existing. There's also things like emotional intelligence. How well do we perceive and understand our own emotions and the emotions of others? So a lot of theories about this. It's a very big area of study. I want to talk a little bit more about intelligence tests, but I just wanted you to be aware that there are quite a few different theories, and I did go into this a little bit more in the textbook. I don't know if any of you have ever taken an intelligence test, an official one, but intelligence tests are very commonly used to assess an individual's mental aptitude. You get a score, and then that score can be compared to other people. And typically, as a part of one of these tests, you answer an incredible number of questions. The most popular intelligence test is something called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. Let me move this down here for a moment. Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. And this is one of the very commonly used tests, and it's got an incredible amount of information that they do on this. And it takes you hours to do. It's administered by a psychologist. And when you're done with this, you'll get a score. Now that score represents your overall IQ, intelligence quotient, right? Your IQ score. And the average score is right around 100, but people can be much higher or lower than that. But most people range right around in the 100, 80 to 120 kind of range is very common. If you take this test, they'll have you arrange blocks. look at picture completion. You will look at vocabulary, defining terms. You'll use uses of objects, right? There's an incredible amount of stuff that you'll do on here to try and get to all these different types of intelligence that somebody might possess. When you're done with it, they average it all out to give you a score, and that score represents your IQ, or again, your intelligence quotient. In order for that test to be a good test, right? And I made a little video on this that I posted on Canvas as well. Whenever you take an intelligence test or a personality test or any kind of test in general, you want to make sure that it has 3 psychometric properties. You want to make sure that it's a good test. And what I mean by good here is that the test is standardized, reliable, and valid. And I guarantee that most of you, if not all of you, have taken a bad test at some point in your life. And they're maddening. They're so frustrating. If you've studied and prepared and you sit down and maybe the test doesn't cover anything that you actually talked about, or the questions are written in a way that's awful, or maybe everybody doesn't have the same version of the test and you feel like yours was unfair. You want a test to be standardized, meaning that you can make a direct comparison. So if I give everybody the same test or a very similar test, then the scores should be able to be directly compared to each other. Think of the SATs or the GREs or the ACTs. There's so many standardized tests. If somebody takes the SATs and gets a score of 1200, that 1200 can be compared to another score on the SATs. We can make a direct comparison because that test is very standardized. We also want a test to be reliable or consistent, to produce stable and dependable scores. If you give somebody a test and then retest them, or give them half of a test and the other half, you want there to be a lot of consistency or reliability between administrations. You also want a test to be valid or accurate, to measure what it's been designed to measure. If I wanted to assess your intelligence and I only gave you a picture completion test, that's not going to give me the whole area of intelligence. I want to make sure that I get a lot of different subsets, different types of intelligence, so that I can accurately measure what I've been trying to measure. Really easy example, think of a scale. A scale is an assessment of your weight, right? You want a scale to be standardized. A scale is calibrated so that a pound is equal to a pound. And the pound at home is the same as the pound at the doctor's office, the same as the one at the gym. So when you step on the scale, you get a very understandable number that you can compare to. If you step on a scale at home and it says 200 pounds, and then the one at the gym says 195, and the one at the doctor's office says 204, something is off, right? So you want it to be calibrated and standardized to be the same. You also want it to be consistent. If you step on a scale and it says 200 today and 400 tomorrow and 180 the next day, there's something really wrong, right? You want it to be really consistent. Maybe it's 200, 201, 199, like right within the same area, but you want it to be consistent and dependable and reliable. You also want it to be valid or accurate. If you step on a scale and it tells you 300 and you know that you weigh closer to 150 or 250 or whatever it might be, right, then it's not going to give you information that is useful. So if a test doesn't have these 3 things, the information that it gives you is largely meaningless. So you want it to be standardized, reliable, and valid in order to be worth using. A couple other things, I think there's 2 or 3 more slides here, a little bit about the IQ debate, intelligence, environment, and heredity. Is intelligence something that is genetic or inborn, or is it more due to the environment and learning? And it's a little bit of both, right? We sometimes use an analogy of plants to help us to understand this idea. If you think about, let's say we take a bag of seeds and we plant half of the bag in field A and half of the bag in field B, right? And field A is like really fertile, rich, wonderful soil. And field B, less fertile soil. It doesn't quite have as many minerals and nutrients. Field A is going to grow taller and stronger and bigger than the ones in field B because the soil is going to account for some of those differences. So the differences between field A and field B and good soil versus bad soil, we can attribute those to the environment. But within each field, there are going to be differences. In field A, all of them got the same soil. Some of the plants are going to grow taller than others. And the differences inside that group, inside field A, we can say are due to more genetic variation. That the differences within this group would be more toward genetics, and the differences between the two fields would be more environment. So the takeaway from this is that it's thought that we're all born with our intelligence capacity, set by our genetics. But whether or not we ever realize or maybe even like exceed our genetic capability has to do a lot with the environment. If we have a really rich environment where we learn and we're encouraged to grow and read and exposed to all sorts of like wonderful, enriching experiences, our intelligence is going to shoot through the roof. Versus if we grow up in an environment where we are not encouraged to read, we don't have any of that like variety or stimulation, then we might have less of our intelligence capacity to be realized. So it's a little bit of an interaction of the two, environment and genetics. Last thoughts, there are some extremes of intelligence. As I mentioned, the average intelligence score is right around 100. And then typically we say that within one standard deviation in either direction. So anywhere between 85 and like 115, this makes up the vast majority of people's level of IQ or intelligence. Now, once you get 2 standard deviations away, somebody who has 130 or higher, we would call gifted. And somebody who has a 70 or lower, we would often classify as having intellectual developmental disorder. So when somebody has very low IQ, sorry, that should say IDD now, we would say that they often struggle with deficiencies in their behavior. They're not able to care for themselves, depending on how severe or profound their IQ score would be. Or if they're way up here on the other end, they might have some kind of very strong area like academic aptitude, maybe it's creativity in some form or leadership. But people are typically right in the middle, but there definitely can be extremes where people are very low in their scores or very high in their scores. Very commonly correlated with people who are gifted is creativity. I'm not an overly creative person, right? I tend to be very like concrete and analytical, but some people are incredibly creative. They're able to produce novel and socially valued ideas or objects. This is something that's very difficult to measure because creativity is all about being outside of the box and thinking outside of the box. It can be difficult to measure it. Oftentimes what we do is we give people an object and have them come up with as many possible uses for that object as they can. And the more they can come up with, the more creative we might deem them to be. But this is something that's difficult to measure, but often viewed as being strongly connected to people being gifted, even if it's just in maybe one specific area. All right, so that is it for our topic on cognition. I hope I've made you want to go do an escape room. I seriously miss doing them. It has been too long. I hope you all can get going on the other required materials for this week, do your reading, do the discussion, everything else that is due. And I will see you all next week for our next topic.